So the Civil War is pretty much about slavery. And when I say that, I don't mean Abraham Lincoln, the president of the United States during the Civil War, or Northerners, people from the North in general, were morally superior, right? They didn't believe slavery was evil necessarily, and that slaves, who are all of African descent, right? They're all black, should be freed, should be given voting rights, because all people are equal, right? The Northerners did not have that attitude. There are Northerners that are very hostile to, have just as many sort of racist attitudes, right? But slavery basically, the fact that the South came to rely on slave labor and were mainly agricultural, the North began to industrialize, started paying people like wages, what they call free labor. It created these very different societies, right? And as America began to move west, new territory began to, start becoming states, basically, right? New territory acquired, wanted to become states. Well, should slavery exist in a state or not? It became such a contentious issue, they eventually fought a war over, right? That's the generalization, but we're one of those states, California. Do you guys know this used to be Mexico? Who knew this used to be Mexico, where we're standing? I mean, it was indigenous folks, maybe the Ohlone, and then it was part of Spain, technically. Then it was part of Mexico in 1821, right? When Mexico gains independence from Spain, the Mexican Empire goes from the California border with Oregon all the way to Panama. It is one of the largest empires in the history in human history, Mexico. But a significant amount of that is lost to the United States in the 1840s, right? California, Colorado, Arizona. I haven't even got to a point yet, have I? I know. You feel like the app for the timer is going to be there all night. Anyways, point being, yeah. So let's just say, so it's basically Civil War is about slavery. The Republican Party, this is a relatively new party. Has anyone ever heard of the term where the Republicans refer to themselves as the GOP? Has anyone ever heard that, GOP? No. It stands for Grand Old Party. It's what the Republicans call themselves. They're actually younger than the Democratic Party by about 20 years. Abraham Lincoln is the first Republican ever elected to the White House. At the time, the party's only a few years old. They are a party, most abolitionists, pretty much all abolitionists, people who oppose slavery, are Republicans. Right? The Republican Party of Lincoln actually ends slavery, gives civil rights to African Americans, supports public education and public infrastructure like railroads, like built, big government spending, basically. Big government spending, which is sort of different from today. Right? Usually we identify the Democrats with, big federal government, lots of spending, lots of taxes. Really quick, actually, let's go back. I'm gonna start in a second. Okay, this is a map. I love maps. Who loves maps? Which I want to choose the best one. There's so many, and they all kind of look the same, but they're a little different. Oh, choices. Here we go. Yeah, there we go. Don't remember this stuff. Don't remember this. So, right, Trump. Who's that? Donald Trump? He was a Democrat, Republican, psycho? Which one? Okay. Republican, right? Republican. The party of Lincoln. The party of Ronald Reagan. The party of Trump. Grab him by the It's like, this is the Confederacy. Right? This is basically the Confederate States. The South, the West, the real America, middle America, right? This is once you leave, and this is true, once you sort of leave, go past San Francisco, and you get on Interstate 80 and start going east, about here, you wouldn't see last summer, you wouldn't see a Hillary Clinton sign until about Denver. And then maybe not another one until Chicago, right? It's the middle of America, lots of corn, there's more white people out there. Not like me, white people. Not like, oh, Starbucks. More like gun rack. I'm just kidding. That's messed up. Anyways, but you see a pattern here, right? This is basically how things go. The Democrats win the cities. Democrats win the North and the West Coast. right? More liberal party, the conservative party wins, this area. But if you look, let's look at a map in 1860. Actually, yeah. Wait, electoral map. Really quick. Yeah, this is the best one. I love these ones. So, yeah, I'll keep it at that size. Right? Lincoln, Republican, red. Oh, see, that's the opposite. All getting votes in New York, right? The whole area. California. Do you know the first Republican candidate for president, 1856? Is a guy named John Fremont. John C. Fremont. There's a town named after him. It has a BART station. MC Hammer used to live there. Full screen. So anyway, Civil War ends. Civil War ends, right? The Republican Party is in control of the government. The Republican Party is going to control the government up until World War I. They're basically going to win every single presidential election. They are the party that ends slavery. They are the party of civil rights. The Democrats are basically the party of white supremacy, the Ku Klux Klan, right? Slavery, wanting to basically, well, you can't bring back slavery, but basically the folks that create the society in the South that you might be familiar with, separate drinking fountains, segregated schools, that whole thing. Mostly Democrats, right? There aren't a lot of Republicans in the South. But in this time period, you have a civil war in which the Union, the United States, wins. There are 11 southern states that separate, form the Confederacy. They fight a war. Confederacy loses. Basically, they fight this war over slavery. And the Union Army, the Army of the North, right, of the United States government, occupies the South. So the war ends in April 1865. It lasted for 4 years. Before the war ends, a few important things happen. Number one, there's this special field order given out by a general named William Tecumseh Sherman, who had invaded some really important parts of the South. He occupies Atlanta, right? He invaded and occupied Atlanta. I think he was just really into Outkast. I don't know why. Right. Outkast. East Point, College Park, Decatur, the ATL. No, you're like, okay. Winning this war. How can we make this transition better? What is it you want, or what goals, you think you should have from this? And these folks, a lot of these former slaves said land. They wanted land, their own land, right? Which is really a promise that, like, part of the American dream back then. Jefferson used to talk about it. The idea of an agrarian republic, of everybody having their own piece of land, right? The Republicans had supported what's called the Homestead Act, where people could move out west, and if you took over a piece of land, like 100 acres, and you lived there for a few years and worked it, you would own it outright, right? Stuff like that. So that idea, and at the time, you have all these slaves. Many of them had worked on plantations, these massive plantations, right? Thousands of acres. And the plantation owners, the slave owners, had left because many of them were in the Confederate government, in the Confederate military, loyal to the Confederate cause. And so when the Union Army showed up, they took off. And slaves basically started occupying the land and working it themselves, right? Because they need to live. They're not going to run away. They have no reason to run from the Union Army. So they start occupying the land and working it themselves. Sherman, this guy general, agrees with that concept, right? Wants to punish the South, wants to punish these wealthy slave owners. And so he issues this thing called Special Field Order 15, which takes land in South Carolina, a place called the Sea Islands. It's like islands off the coast of South Carolina. And takes this land that had belonged to wealthy slave owners and redistributes it amongst the slaves that had been there, right? Amongst former slaves. To work the land themselves, right? Has anybody heard of the expression 40 acres and a mule? 40 acres and a mule, right? There was this idea that slaves got 40 acres and a mule. They did not. It comes from this. There are some slaves that got some land, right? There was a time where this idea was promoted, but so that's kind of important. Slaves are clearly establishing Well, we want land. One of the reasons they want land is they kind of want to be left alone, right? They want to have their own piece of land where they're not under the direct supervision of white Southerners, because that's been going on for a very long time, and it's been a very violent system, right? You know, people being basically working land as slaves. You have a white overseer who is physically abusive. There's sexual abuse that is rampant, right? So this idea of you know, land is a big thing. Let's say mid-January, January 31st, the 13th Amendment passes. The 13th Amendment, which ends slavery, abolishes slavery, sort of, you know. So, and it's a very big deal. The 13th Amendment is passed because, does anybody know there's something that Lincoln wrote as president, an executive order prior to this that kind of ended freed slaves, but not really? The Emancipation Proclamation. Good, am I good? Look at that in the head. The Emancipation Proclamation, right? Which had been issued during a time of war. It's an executive order. They're worried that Lincoln was worried it would not hold up, you know, against like Supreme Court review after the war, right? One of the ways that the United States justified freeing slaves, taking slaves during the war, basically, you know, giving them their freedom in some ways, or if slaves already escaped and gained their own freedom and came to the Union lines, one of the ways they were able to justify this was military expedience, right? The South, the Confederacy, was using slaves to dig trenches, to build railroads. They were using them for the war effort. So it's like, it was almost like using their own logic against them, right? This is a piece of property of yours used for the war, so we're going to commandeer it, like you would commandeer a cannon or a boat or something, right? But they're people, so they, yeah. There's a lot of, so there were, slaves were definitely used in the war effort in that regard. There's a lot of stuff, and there might still be something on Wikipedia that says 65,000 slaves fought for the Confederate Army. That's not true. Once again, there's a whole movement on the internet that tries to claim that blacks in massive numbers, slaves in massive numbers, fought for the Confederate States of America. It's not true. Right? If you type in Black Confederate soldier, Google search it, there's a website, and they show you pictures where it's like a reunion of Civil War veterans, and it's a bunch of white guys and like one black guy. And they're like, see, look, right there. It's, you know, it did not happen. 65, I mean, there were some that were maybe Creole, mixed Indian, white, black, you know, that ended up fighting. And the South was on the verge of approving arming slaves because they were so desperate near the end, but it never happened, right? The Union Army did arm slaves. The Union Army in the Emancipation Proclamation said, if slaves come to the Union lines, we will, and they want to be trained as soldiers and go fight, we will arm them, and we will let them do that. That was a pretty big deal, the idea of taking these slaves who had lived in a society where it was illegal in many cases for them to own guns. It was illegal for them to learn how to read, right? Training them as soldiers and sending them into the South to actually go shoot at white people. Pretty cool. It was probably pretty cool for them. I mean, I shouldn't say that, but you know what I'm saying. Empowering, very empowering. So the 13th Amendment is passed so that it's in the Constitution, slavery is outlawed, right? This isn't something we did during the Civil War. In order to ensure that this is gone, they passed the 13th Amendment. This is a very big deal, right? Not just because it ends slavery. Does anyone know how many slaves there were in the United States in 1860, during this time? No, 4 million, nearly 4 million. Yeah, there were about 250,000 during the time of the Revolution. You know, when they're Jefferson and Washington, they're debating about, well, they own slaves, but they kind of know slavery is kind of not a good thing, but they don't really do anything about it. You know, they sort of let it go, and slavery ends up growing substantially. It becomes monumental, right? Because the North is industrial. I mean, in the 1800s, the North begins to industrialize. There are factories opening up, factories that make like things like textile. What's textile? You know what textile is? Clothing, like a fabric. It's fabric. It's cloth, right? So comparable thing to what was happening in the U.S. then would be like the garment industry in Bangladesh, right? Like massive amounts of people starting to work in this industry. in order to get textiles, cloth, you need cotton. So where's the cotton coming from, right? The South. So slaves are cultivating this stuff, and it's fueling all these factories in the North. So there ends up being this massive amount of slaves. But the 13th Amendment ends that, right? The 13th Amendment ends that. And also, shortly before the war ends, there is an organization set up called the Freedmen's. Is it Freedmen? Freedmen's Bureau. Freedmen's Bureau, right? Which is, it's basically a federal agency which is going to be active in the former Confederacy in the states and lead the transition or mediate the transition between whites and blacks in this new society, right? There was a society where pretty much if you were black, you were a slave. Slavery was identified with being black. They were synonymous. And as a result, there's this whole socially constructed idea of race, right? Where whites are superior, blacks aren't. They're not as smart. They're not as capable, stuff. All of these things, all these negative, really negative stereotypes, right? And people believe these things, right? And people were used to having a situation where black people in the South were owned by somebody, could be physically abused, sexually abused by somebody, and they had no legal rights whatsoever, right? And all of a sudden, that ends, right? They can leave a plantation if they don't like it. They're not running away. They're not a runaway slave. They're just leaving. They can legally get married, right? They can eventually start to vote. They can go to school. So they're going to have to work for wages. In most instances, a lot of these wealthy slave owners throughout the South retain their land. They're going to be still on the land. So slaves are going to end up having to deal with them, working on their land, negotiating some sort of contract for wages or something, as opposed to just being slaves, right? The Freedmen's Bureau is going to deal with all of that, right? If a former slave is working on a field of a former slave owner and the former slave owner tries to physically abuse somebody, or there's an altercation, because that's the kind of thing that is not supposed to happen anymore. So it's a lot of times those arguments would end up in the Freedmen's Bureau. Freedmen's Bureau.
Is that like part of the government? Or?
It's a federal agency, yeah. It was led by a guy named O.O. Howard. It was a general. I think it was a general. It was a federal agency, but it was very much there was a military sort of presence within it. It was civilian military. There were people from the North who went to the South to help set up schools, right? Because you had a public education system that was starting in the North. There was no public education in the South, right? 95% of slaves are illiterate, and a lot of poor white Southerners have never been to a school, right? If you went to the South and even the West, there was not a formal education system. Abraham Lincoln only had 1 year of formal education. He had it all. Like he would go to school for 2 weeks here, and then so there was a lot of illiteracy. They basically set up schools, set up hospitals, right? Mediate between former slave owners and their slaves about how much they should get paid, right? At times, stuff like that. But the issue of land, this field order thing is important because there was the recognition. Some people that recognize that there was basically a debate: should we take the land of wealthy slave owners and divide it up and give it to slaves, right? I mean, you can think about you have a wealthy slave owner who owns 200 slaves, right? And we're talking about generations of physical abuse, sexual abuse, of making money off of these people who aren't getting paid. I mean, it might seem fair to just take that person's land and give it to the slaves, right? Maybe? No? I don't know. Has anyone ever heard of a term called agrarian reform or land reform? It's something that the reason this doesn't happen is what you call land reform, right? Taking land from a wealthy slave owner and giving it to all these slaves, right? It doesn't happen for a couple of reasons. One, the slaves themselves, there are nearly 4 million slaves. Did these slave owners just get them for free? And they started working for them? I mean, did they just find them on the side of the road and then capture them? They paid for them, right? They had to pay money for these slaves. Slaves had value as property. Does anyone know how much, if you took all these slaves, 3.5, 4 million, how much money they were all worth together? in 1860, not in today's. $3 billion. In 1860, $3 billion. It was the largest concentration of wealth, and they were owned by a small group of people. Like 4% of white Southerners owned 20 or more slaves. Like, you know, like today we have the, if you remember the Occupy Wall Street movement, the 99%, the 1%, that whole idea. There was like a 1% of Southern society that owned all these slaves, right? So the idea of basically what happens with the 13th Amendment is $3 billion worth of property is taken from wealthy slave owners already. They've already lost $3 billion worth of property, you know? And I mean, this is one of those things where you kind of have to like, it's hard to separate this issue from the fact that we live in 2017 and slavery is wrong. Some of you might think, who gives a shit, right? I mean, they bought other human beings. They were in many instances, not very nice to them. In a lot of ways, there's a lot of like rape and stuff that happened. So I don't care if they lose their everything. They should kill them, you know? But you have to sort of suspend our attitude in the modern world and look at it like from the perspective of people living in that time, the mid-19th century, right? Imagine you're somebody who bought a slave, who saved up, you bought your own piece of land and you saved up through the 1840s, 1850s, and you finally got enough money, like 1859, 1862, somewhere in there, you finally got enough money and it's like, oh, I'm gonna buy a slave, because that's what we do in the South. And then you bought this slave and you spent like $1,000, all the money you saved over 10 years. And then if 2 years later, they're like, oh, no, it's illegal now, you can't do this. You'd be a little upset, right? You can see, I mean, you can kind of see, no, okay, you don't have to see. You know, I wasn't there. But the very fact, the idea of liberating slaves, it's basically the largest eminent domain situation probably in human history, right? You know where eminent domain, where it's, we have to build a road here, but you have a house here. So we're gonna compensate you for the house, you know? So it was something like that, basically, where it's like, where even though you legally own these slaves, it was legal, right? That's what makes, has anyone ever heard of reparations? The concept of reparations, of paying the ancestors of former slaves for slavery, right? It's one of the things that complicates it is that slavery was legal. There was no United Nations, there was no Human Rights Watch, you know, there was nothing like that. It was completely legal. So it's hard, you know. So yeah, so that's one of the reasons there's no land reform. Just the very fact that slaves had been freed basically meant that the people that owned them lost, if you add it all together, $3 billion worth of property.
Were they able to like fight for their land then? With like the white owners were able to like fight for their land?
Oh yeah, most of them got it. A lot of them got it back. Yeah, very few. Well, hopefully I'll get into that. I don't know what time it is. Yeah, they basically got it back. One reason is that the slaves themselves were worth so much. It was already a big deal. It was already a huge loss of property. Second, if you take a large plantation that's growing cotton, the economy is becoming more national, more global, right? The North needs this cotton to build textiles. They're selling those textiles all over to Europe or whatever, right? There's this need that if someone has like 10,000 acres of land and they're a huge slave owner, produce cotton, massive amounts of cotton. If you divide up that land and give it to slaves, they might grow some cotton, but they need to live, right? They need to eat. You can't eat cotton. I tried. Gives you cotton mouth. I'm recording this. It's tapping. It's tapping. Tap, 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 tap. Okay. So they'll grow maybe a little corn. They'll have like a vegetable garden. Maybe they'll grow some cotton, but it'll disrupt this global economy. You know, there's a global market. So even though we think, well, these slaves is like they were treated really badly, and they kind of aren't. You know, you're thinking someone's great grandfather and grandfather and father, and then them or mother. You know, and mother, grandmother had basically worked for free. You know, for how many generations? Maybe they earned the land. Maybe they just get it, but it would disrupt disrupt the national economy. And also the idea of like taking land from people and giving it to basically poor people, right? Taking land from wealthy people, redistributing it amongst the more poor elements of that society, slaves in this instance, is something that doesn't really happen until the 20th century, right? When you have communist revolutions, various communist revolutions. China is a very good example. If anyone reads about the Chinese revolution, communist revolution, communists come into China in 1949, and there was a lot, mostly peasants in China, right? And very wealthy landlords, very abusive landlords, very similar in a lot of ways, but some of these landlords were not the greatest people. Not that the Communist Party in China ended up doing, some of the stuff they did was a little off, but they basically would take these wealthy landlords in front of a whole village, and all these villagers would come up and talk about how badly this landlord had treated them for years. You can see footage of it. There's actually footage of it because they'd slap them around a little bit, and then they would take all their stuff and divide it amongst these peasants. Like literally, they would take it and divide it equally. So this guy had 4 peasants that lived on his land, and there was one draft animal, one oxen. They would say, okay, well, you get it Monday, Tuesday, and then you get it on Wednesday, Friday, and they had this whole system where they divided wealthy people's stuff up among a larger population of poor people. But that's later. So anyways, so this is basically like things that the federal government's doing, right? There's some people that think, hey, land redistribution, take land, and that doesn't really happen. But slavery does end with the 13th Amendment. The Freedmen's Bureau is set up to help set up schools, eventually try to guarantee the right to vote for former slaves, mediate this new society, right? Because, for the slaves themselves, there are 3 really important things: family, church, and school. What do I mean with families? When it says families, what does that mean? Families was important for slaves. To reunite, right? Children, husbands, wives that had been sold and maybe were in separate states because they weren't actually under slavery. If your child was sold to another plantation and you don't know where they are, in Southern life with slavery being legal, that wasn't your son, that wasn't your daughter. That was somebody else's property, right? Marriages were not legally recognized. You're not a wife, you're not a husband, you're not a father. You have no legal guardianship over any of your family members, right? Because at the end of the day, you are somebody's property. There were laws that set up early on that protected wealthy slave owners when they committed sexual assault against female slaves, right? Where they would slaves would be raped, there would be children produced from that rape, and those children would be considered property of the slave owner. Even though, and we're talking about someone who's the biological father, and they're living in some slave quarters. They're not recognized as his children, but everyone basically, knows. I mean, you can imagine that kind of situation if you're in a slave marriage. You're the husband of a slave, and your wife, who's a slave, is sexually assaulted and gives birth to the child of the owner. What are you gonna do? You can't do anything. You can't sue the guy. You can't shoot him. It's illegal for you to own a gun, right? You have no legal recourse whatsoever. It happened. Sometimes it happened. Slaves would, female slaves would fight back, or in various instances. But you would end up having to run away, or you'd be punished, or you could be killed. So family. That's a really big one. Yeah. So when these page numbers I think might be off. I'm sorry. They're from a different edition. I need to work on that. It's in there somewhere in chapter 15. So when it comes to families, this is a statement from chapter 15. Freed women had withdrawn from field labor. There was this huge reaction by white Southerners too, but there used to be so many women in the fields. Where did all the former female slaves go? Where did black women go to? They all disappeared, right? They're all fulfilling a domestic role that they had been rejected to them. For the very first time, they get to be mothers. They get to be wives, and it's legally recognized. It's not, well, you're my property. I let you get married. I let you have kids, but you're working for me 12, 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. And if you go home and you actually do things that we identify as traditionally motherly duties or family duties, it's because I let you, right? See what I'm saying? So for the first time, there's a legal recognition of, no, we have protection over our wives. They are going, and the idea of removing women from the direct supervision of whites, of white men, white overseers, right? I mean, it's actually, you think about it, there's a lot of dialogue about this in the news, off and on about the idea of domestic violence or sexual assault, stuff like that, right? In the military, in civilian life. And it's something that's an issue today, when there's all sorts of groups and there's news networks that cover it, and Rolling Stone magazine does the thing, and there's protests and there's ribbons and there's all sorts of, there's still massive problems surrounding this, right? Where starting with the issue of rape and stuff like that. But imagine living in a society like the South before the Civil War, where there's no legal recourse for raping a slave. Like, you're not going to get punished, right? If you're the slave owner, you're not going to get punished. If a child is produced from that rape, you can just own them. That's someone you're going to get to own for the rest of their lives. It's like free. It's like it's almost an investment, And there's no legal recourse. So it's something that happened quite often, right? Thomas Jefferson. You guys know Thomas Jefferson? He wrote most of the Declaration of Independence. He had 5 children with one of his slaves, which their relationship was more, this is another thing too, people, like, they had a consensual relationship. Well, how is it really consensual if one person is the other person's property, right? There's a power dynamic there, which kind of complicates. It's not like the name of the slave that he had a relationship with was Sally Hemings. It's not like she could just dump him and walk off. Like, I'm leaving, I'm gonna go find another guy. It's like, no, I own you. And Sally Hemings, actually Jefferson's slave girlfriend, mistress, was half white. She was actually his half sister-in-law. You know that? Yeah. Some Jerry Springer stuff right there, man. Yeah. And the church is very important. The Black church is very important. It's the only really independent, it's the only really autonomous Black institution into the 20th century, right? This is very important because if you look at the civil rights movement, once you, about a century after this, when there's still issues of voting rights and discrimination, right? You have a civil rights movement. Who's the main civil rights leader guy who had the dream? MLK, Martin Luther King, Reverend Martin Luther King. He's a minister, right? And the organization that led a lot of the early civil rights struggles in the 50s and early 60s was called the Southern Christian Leadership Coalition, right? They were pastors and ministers because they depended on, in order for them to make a living, to be independent, to basically have a house and a life. They depended on other Black people. Black people would come to the church. They pass the hat around, right? They donate money, and that's what a minister would live on, as opposed to somebody who might be a business owner that would rely on white customers. And if they started speaking about how they wanted the right to vote, or they thought segregation was wrong, a lot of those white customers might go away, right? And their livelihood would be threatened. So the Black church is a very important thing. And it's still a very, in many ways, an important thing. And school, education, right? Education, land. Slaves want land, but also reuniting families, establishing their own churches, education, right? Getting an education, learning how to read and write, and also voting rights become a major thing. Voting rights are big, right? These are main issues that everybody goes for. We want to vote. We want a political voice. We want our own churches. We want our own families. We want our own cultural independence. We want our own political rights, and then land. We want economic rights also. You see this today, right? You see this today with there's all issues similar to this. Like, there's issues around the issue of voting is still a major thing. Who can vote, who can't vote? Should people have to show ID? Are there illegal votes? People voting illegally? All these things. There's issues around voting and who's a citizen, right? If people that came over across the border undocumented, but as a 2-year-old and they're 20 now. Do they get to be, right? Abraham Lincoln, who is the president during the Civil War, the war, basically, the war lasts his entire presidency, right? By the time he gets to Washington, D.C. and takes office, the Confederate States have been formed. Southern states have left. They formed the Confederacy. They have their own president. And a month into his presidency, people start shooting at each other, right? The war ends about a week before Lincoln gets shot, right? So he had to spend his entire presidency. He's in Washington, D.C. He's working about 20 hours a day. He sleeps maybe on average. And this is not in a 21st century world where you can fly or drive home. He basically leaves Illinois, goes to DC. He never goes home. He never leaves the capital, right? He spends a little time in nearby in Virginia during the war. He visits generals on the front, but that's about it. He's working about 20 hours a day. He ends up getting, and clearly, he had the Emancipation Proclamation. He pushed the 13th Amendment through. He has an idea of how he's going to conduct things after the Civil War, how this Reconstruction is going to look. But about a week after the South surrendered, Lincoln dies. And the problem with Lincoln dying is he had run for re-election during the Civil War. And since almost all Republicans were in the North, right? And the South was basically entirely Democrats. Like Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot in southern states in both elections. He as a way to extend goodwill, like a political olive branch, when he runs for re-election, he says, I'm going to make a Democrat my vice presidential running mate. This guy from the South, I'm going to make this guy from the South who's loyal to the Union, but he's from the South. He's a Democrat. He's kind of a racist. He's basically a racist guy. I mean, Lincoln had his own, everyone was kind of racist back then, but, I'm going to make this guy named Andrew Johnson my vice presidential running mate, because the vice president really doesn't do anything and it just looks good on paper. But then he gets shot, He had been in Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy. He'd been there like a week earlier, walked around. People were freaked out thinking he was going to get a sniper or somebody who was going to, not like snipers like today, but 1800 snipers. I don't know. That somebody would be sticking around some church tower or something would shoot him. Didn't happen. War ends, he goes to a play and gets shot in the head. It's a bummer. He looks like a really cool guy. He's got that beard. So doesn't he look so sad? They all look like that in the pictures. They didn't smile because they had to hold the pose for like 10 minutes. So, anyways. Yeah. So Lincoln is dead, basically. This other guy who no one ever thought would be president is now president and is leading this thing called Reconstruction. Lincoln is there during all of this, right? We're gonna have a new South. Slavery is gonna end. Maybe at some point voting rights will be extended to slaves. All this stuff, right? Dealing with civil rights and equality. And then all of a sudden, this guy from Tennessee, this white, pretty racist guy, takes over, and he's president. And so he basically leads Reconstruction. He basically pardons almost every single Confederate general, member of the Confederate government. Pretty much all of them get their land back if they abandon their land or it was occupied. Even in situations where slaves occupied the land, even in situations where the Union Army had supported that occupation with like orders like that, right? To occupy this land. This is yours now. These people, they were rebellious basically in the eyes of Northerners. Even in that situation, those folks that the Union Army had given land to or allowed to continue to occupy land, they were kicked off of the land, basically. A lot of them, right? Land was given back to wealthy Southerners, wealthy slave owners, and so land reform is out. Some of the only slave owners who lost their land and didn't get it back were the Cherokee, right? Because there were members of the Cherokee Nation who became very successful farmers and actually owned slaves, right? So there are also black people that own slaves, but that's a very tough. That's a hard. When there's numbers on it, but it's very hard to sort of figure out because a lot of people would buy their relatives, like family members, and technically they owned them, but it was because the laws against freeing people was very hard at times. So you would buy like a child or a spouse, and you owned them, but it was really just so that it could be a family would be reunited, it could live together, right? And you legally couldn't free them, so it was like on paper you own them, There's usually if some people will bring this up too, they'll try to bring up, well, you see black people owned slaves too, so it couldn't have been racist. Well, for all the slaves were black, right? All the victims. It's kind of like does anyone remember the Trayvon Martin shooting? This is an opinion, right? The guy who shot Trayvon, a cop didn't shoot Trayvon Martin, right? He thought he was a cop. He was this, right? Do you guys know the name of the person who shot? Do you remember this in Florida? This is about 2012. A 17-year-old kid is shot by some, community member who's like neighborhood watch. He's driving around with a gun. All the media is reporting is that this unarmed black kid gets shot. The person who ended up shooting him is half Peruvian. His mother's Peruvian, so he's not white. And people thought, oh, look at this. Well, clearly it wasn't racist because this guy's not even white. But the kid who's on the ground, who's dead, is still, black. And nobody really, the idea behind that some people think is, nobody, there's not a lot of concern for that, right? Yes. This is one of the reasons the chapter of this book is actually called "What is Freedom?" and it's in quotation marks. It was sort of a question posited by I think it was a former slave owner. The idea of what is freedom, right? If you don't own any land, if you all of a sudden you were owned by this person, you lived on their plantation. Now it's like, well, you're free. I mean, there's no means with which you don't have your own land, so you have to basically go back to some people stayed on the plantations that they had been slaves on, but now as negotiating some sort of compensation, predominantly in the form of sharecropping. It's pretty self-explanatory, right? Sharecropping. The former slave owners owned the land. Former slaves worked on the land, right? They were the ones that grew the crop, and then they would split it theoretically. There'd be some sort of way to split it. There are white folks that sharecrop too. There are white Southerners who were sharecroppers. A lot of poor people that didn't have any land of their own would live on the land of wealthy landowners, and they would work the land, right? They'd work it as a family, basically. It wasn't like a plantation where there are a bunch of slaves. It's like gang labor, and there's an overseer supervising it directly. You basically got a piece of land on your own, and you got to you have a little more independence, but at the end of the day, a certain percentage of the crop you grew had to go to this person who wasn't really doing anything other than they were owning land. It's called sharecropping. So that was exhausting. So yeah. You know what? Is this one slide? How long did I go? One slide? Like someone say like hella long. Did somebody say hella long? Like hella long, man. Oh shit, really? That's cool. We're gonna edit that out. Oh shoot. Yeah, let's take a break. So here's the deal. Since we ended on sharecropping, yeah, I'm not gonna do it anymore. I can't. That's too much. I'm not gonna subject you guys to that anymore.